We have quite a short session given the amount of topics we could discuss about energy storage and energy storage planning and deployment, which covers a whole lot of things. And we have a great panel to talk about it. Each of them has a brief PowerPoint presentation. So I'll ask each of them in turn to make their presentation, introduce themselves and make their presentation. And then at the end of the three presentations, if we have a few minutes left, then we'll have a sort of question and answer session. And we've been asked strictly to finish by 4:20, which is 40 minutes from now. So let's go in the order that people appear on the agenda. So starting with Akram Wahid, if you'd like to introduce yourself and make your presentation, please.
Good afternoon again. I'll just run through a bit of introduction anyways, if anyone hasn't been here in the previous session. My name is Akram Wahid and I work with the Ministry of Environment and Energy, as well as the Maldives Energy Authority, which is the regulating agency which is running under the ministry. And basically, what we like to be touching upon is mainly on the sort of bit of background on how our renewable journey has sort of progressed and what's the sort of importance in the storage in sort of reaching our sort of targets. Right, okay. So basically just to give a bit of background on the Maldives, we have around 1,190 islands with, out of that, 188 inhabited islands and over 100 resorts. And we also do have a population of 500,000, and our GDP is around 80 billion. That's in rupiah. So basically, our sort of angle on renewable energy is one is being on the sort of forefront in fighting climate change, but also on having the reducing the dependency on fossil fuels. So I'll just start to give a bit of a brief background on how the power sector has sort of evolved. Basically, we do have, when we compare the sort of the energy sort of imports to the country, that's almost equivalent to around 80% of the GDP. And when you see the fraction of the imports, around 80% of that goes to just diesel only. And out of that diesel, about 65 to 70% goes for the electricity production that is nationwide. And this is just to give you an idea of the magnitude. And these are the CIF values reported in 2016. So just to give an idea about the sort of how the international fuel price is really affecting our sort of imports. You can see from the graph here, there's been peaks in around 2008, and which is directly reflected in our sort of imports in the same period. And similarly for between 2012 and 2014, the price hike has directly reflected on the fuel bill as well. So on the overall sort of governance structure, the energy sector is more or less led by the Ministry of Environment. That's the body responsible for planning and improving the energy sector. And We also do have the regulatory body which is working under the Ministry of Environment, and the regulatory body was previously responsible for the development and implementation of the regulations, but now the Ministry of Environment developed the regulations, and Energy Authority implements these regulations. And I'll come to a bit of examples on the regulatory side in a bit. And we also do have the Environmental Protection Agency within the umbrella of the ministry that's regulating the environmental related aspects. And then we do have utilities who are the government-owned companies responsible for power production and distribution all inhabited islands. There are main two utility companies here. And then there are other sort of key stakeholder institutions like the President Office, Ministry of National Planning, Economic Development, and local councils who are involved in all sector level activities since power is part of the overall infrastructure development. Now, on the overall sort of production, Maldives achieved 100% electrification in 2008, and I mean the basic structure is a diesel-based production system consisting of like a mini grid. Mostly it's LV system, but we do have a handful of HV system also, and we do have a demand growth of 8 to 11%, and the total installed capacity in inhabited island now is about 238, and when you add up the resorts it goes up to about 400. Now from the graph here you can see the majority of this is a log graph by log scale, by the way. So the majority of the installations in these islands are very small. It ranges from 0 to like 1,000 kilowatts. So above 1 megawatt we just have a handful of islands, and our capital is an exception with installed capacity of now about 80 megawatts. So basically one of the sort of key issue is the cost of production, which ranges from 22 cents per kilowatt hour in large islands, and it goes up to 31 cents in smaller islands, and that's including fuel and operation and maintenance costs. So the fuel constitutes of like close to 70 to 80% of the cost of production. So that has the sort of major impact on the actual cost of production. Now, in order to sort of sustain the end user tariffs, government is sort of providing a lot of subsidy to sustain that, but on the long run, the fuel bill keeps on increasing, and we need a way to sort of address that, and that's where sort of renewables come in. There has been a number of renewable projects that has been conducted over the past decade or so, but most of it in the beginning were very small pilot projects, and at that time, a lot of these, there were a number of funding issues because renewables were much expensive then. And right now we do have 16 megawatts of solar PV installed so far, and our sort of next target in terms of project implementation goes up to 21 megawatts. And we do have a sort of a target revision from 10% of energy to 70% of energy mix in the power sector, which also our minister has sort of highlighted in the climate summit. So one of the key challenges, I mean, these are some of the key challenges in power generation. Geographic distribution sort of limits us from, interconnecting the grids, and we don't have a sort of a unified grid which sort of enables efficiency, and all these isolations also increase cost of production in smaller scale. And there's also limited human resource capacity, especially in the remote islands, which sort of limits overall efficiency due to improper maintenance. And there's obviously a high demand growth that we really need to keep on increasing the megawatt installation capacities. So on renewable energy, in order to sort of progress our sort of work on renewable energy, there's been a number of interventions that had sort of happened over the past couple of years. So I'm just sort of highlighting some of the key interventions, both from the policy side and the regulatory side. So one of the first sort of intervention was duty exemption introduced in 2012 through amendment to the Import-Export Act, and that has been also delegated to Energy Authority for the implementation of this process. And then in 2013, we started on developing a regulatory framework with support from World Bank and ADB, and that sort of produced a number of set key regulations, including operator licensing, electricians, engineer licensing, and which builds upon what was already sort of developed. And in one of the key regulation is the operator licensing regulation, which sort of covers the licensing for any type of operator, whether it be utility or resorts, self-operating entities, and even independent power producers. Before this regulation, we didn't really have an IPP sort of recognition, but that came important when private investments started to come, private developers started to come into Maldives, and having this IPP sort of structure actually helps to sort of raise financing for their projects by that sort of recognition as well. So and that's and also we did sort of start on the net metering regulation in 2016. So basically, net metering regulation allowed end users to offset 100% of their own electricity. Unlike a lot of countries who has fixed capacity, what we resorted was on to look at the energy consumption for the year and then use that to size their system. So 100% can be offset. And we are also considering amendment of this regulation to allow for utility to pay for any excess energy that will be produced. And the other sort of one of the major sort of intervention would be the scaling up of the renewable energy program, which started in 2014. Under this, we had private sector investment project poised and also public sector investment project, which looked at smaller outer islands. And the private sector component looked at large outer islands, primarily through a PPA model, which was backed by guarantees supported by the World Bank. And the poised component included mostly grants and loans, which was supported through ADB. And so I'm just gonna sort of quickly run through it, and just to mention, SREP is sort of initiated through the climate investment funds, and that just give us an overview. So with Poised, we did have a number of experiences with number of islands, and we have around 50 to 300 kilowatt hour systems installed, and energy mix in the range of 10 to 50%. And in the Aspire project, we did look at 1.5 megawatt, 5 megawatts without storage, but in the next phase, we will look at large scale storage, possibly in the range of 50 to 100. So some of the existing challenges are in limited land space and obviously smaller scale and limited experience in some of the commercial technologies. And we do have untapped resources that haven't really been sort of explored yet, like mainly marine technologies. And just putting up some images. The second image is from the 1.5 megawatts, and the first one is from the public sector investments. Obviously, there are a lot of projects, so I didn't just selected some of these installations, larger ones. So So our sort of, this graph shows how the PV has increased over the past 10 years. It has grown up to 16 megawatts exponentially, and we hope to double that, more than double that in the next couple of years. So again, our sort of new target is 70% energy, and so that means we'll need to sort of shift from that.
We're getting frantic signals from the back about time. So.
Okay, yeah. So okay. I'm just last couple of slides. So we'll need to move from the orange line to the green line if we are to achieve those targets. So so basically, just moving on storage, it's just we'll need to look at much larger scale, and although we've been experiencing scales from kilowatt hours, we'll be moving on to megawatt hours hopefully in the next set of sub projects, and we are in discussion with World Bank in project formulation. So I'm just gonna skip those slides, and some of the actions needed would include incentives and capacity building, knowledge exchange, as well as exploration of new technologies. And so our sort of approach would be, key approach would be to roll out much larger scale programs in order to achieve these high targets, and also look at granular level interventions on maximizing renewable energy use. So I think that sort of sums up the presentation. So I'm constrained on a bit of time, so just wanted to sort of highlight this on the last slide, that 70% is our sort of new target. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes.
So I have 10 minutes? 8?
Let's say 8.
Okay, better. Akram, you owe me a drink. Yeah. Okay.
I'll take 2 by the time you
Okay, so those who were here in the regulatory session, hello again, and those who were not. I'm Harsh Thakkar. I represent India Energy Storage Alliance. And in this session, I'll be talking about 3 emerging applications in India market, which are very much scalable at this point of time, but require some kind of intervention to scale things up. So as you can see, we sold almost 24 gigawatt hours of batteries in 2018, and in 2026, this can be close to 38 gigawatt hour across applications, and most of them were behind the meter applications. So today we are going to talk both like behind the meter and grid scale applications, which are scalable at this point of time, but require some kind of intervention, and that's where I think your support would be very helpful. So the first application is the diesel optimization. As you can see, there is almost like a 90 gigawatt of diesel gensets installed in India across different sectors. So for a 180 gigawatt of peak load, half is backed by diesel genset, and that's incredible. But most of them are not running for a long time. So it's more like an insurance for the supply, irregular supply. So as you can see, only 2% of it is running for more than 1,000 hours per year, and 10% of it is running for more than 500 hours per year. And that 2% is something which is achievable for hybridization now at current energy storage prices. Yeah. So the question is, if it's achievable, why it's not happening? And in one of the morning session, it was mentioned that the capex of battery, the lithium-ion battery, is almost like 4x of capex of diesel genset. So what you can see in the green is basically the capex of a battery. So if you're not running battery, it's basically not viable for replacing the diesel genset. But if you're running the diesel genset for 700 hours, which is in this case, the battery becomes kind of viable. So the cost of ownership is lesser in this case. Now, if you see the 2025 case, you see it's even coming down. And if you charge the battery by solar, it's even better because solar prices would be much cheaper than the grid prices. So what it requires at this point of time is kind of a ESCO fund, which can enable this. Secondly, we would need to work with diesel genset company because they know which are these 2% of diesel gensets which are running for more than 1,000 hours. So we have spoken to the major diesel genset companies in India, and they are ready for this intervention, but we need support to move ahead in this direction. And the third big risk in here is, like many of the parts, they believe the grid would improve in 3 to 4 years. So again, like we need to think about the kind of ESCO model which can be scalable. Okay. Yeah, so these are some early adopters. So almost 100,000 towers where diesel genset have been removed or the usage has been minimalized. 5,000 ATMs, over 1,000 microgrids, where there was a DG which was selling a 60-cent power, and a microgrid came in and it was selling a 30-cent power. So there was a village where a microgrid came in and it replaced the diesel genset guy. The genset guy was then buying power from the microgrid and he was supplying to the village. But the bad news is, after some point of time, the load increased and the microgrid had to install the diesel genset. Yeah, so those are some kind of interesting stories from the ground. Yeah, and when we speak about rural electrification, so India achieved 100% electrification in this year. Thanks, we had an election this year. And yeah. So majority of it was done through grid. So grid has reached, but electron have not reached yet. And yeah. This is fun. 8 minutes is fun, yeah. So what happened this year is like more than 1 million of this villages or households were basically reached through a solar panel on each household, and which was backed with the lithium-ion battery. So as you can see, that yellow and blue thing, the majority of share last year for technology and energy storage in rural India was lithium-ion, which is not always the case because most of the microgrids are built with lead acid. But last year, most of the household systems were installed with lithium-ion. So intervention in this case would be required. As I said, the grid has reached, but electrons have not. So actually now we have the infrastructure to use and sell energy. So it's actually reduced the cost for upcoming mini grids, which can use that network. We would just require some kind of policy intervention to have grid-connected microgrids and can help with the economic development of the rural India, because at 60 cents, 30 cents per kilowatt hour, you cannot actually go for economic development. And yeah, I'll just skip this one. Is there some direction where I should be clicking? Okay. Yeah, and this is a status of the kind of our experience from monitoring of microgrid. So we are generally talking about like why things are failing and what's the performance of microgrid. Unfortunately, not many of the microgrids or mini grids have been monitored. So as per our experience of monitoring of 35 different microgrids in India, we see that the battery utilization is very low. It has been 18% to 20% on an average because initially, like you don't have a lot of load. Then the solar generation, which is almost like 4 to 5 kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak of solar installed in India, we are seeing this microgrids are doing 2.5 units. And the battery efficiency is much less than what the manufacturers are claiming. Yeah. So generally, we have been listening that the microgrids have been kind of designed with the help of Homer and kind of tools. But our observation is it's more designed by the kind of funding they have. So if it's government funded, like they are generously sized, the size of battery. If it's CSR funded, it's the size is lesser. And if there is a funding which requires return, like the battery is size even smaller. So you can see in a government tender, they ask for a 7.3 or to 12 kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak of solar. That's a kind of a ratio of a battery to solar. In CSR funded, it's mostly around 3 to 6 kilowatt hour of battery per kilowatt peak of solar. And if you see this kind of funding with expected return, and return is almost like 6 to 10%, which is out there. So it's almost like 1 to 2.5 kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak of solar. So there is no Homer which is being used here. It's pure funding that. Yeah. Yeah. And this has been the kind of issue with the lead-acid battery on the ground. So we have been seeing almost like a 10 to 20% capacity fade in a month, in 20 to 25 cycles. So this is actually a test done in lab with solar plant. And we have seen that with 80% DOD cycles, the capacity degradation in a new battery in first month is 20%. Now this is lower if the DOD cycles are lesser, which generally are lesser. But the problem is like you require equalization intervention with these batteries, and it's a very difficult thing to manage it in like grids like Asia and Africa, where the skill set at ground level are very low, and they are not able to do this kind of O&M with the batteries. So hence, here we require support of different technologies, and right now, these markets are thinking about second life lithium-ion batteries, and but we would have some kind of issues there with these trials, because mostly right now, it's the Western markets and China, Japan, which are having excess of used batteries. And to bring it to emerging markets, the regulations won't allow, because with respect to lead acid, the used batteries are basically a hazardous waste, which cannot be permitted. So we would need to work around regulations for doing some pilots there. So yeah, so that's on the rural microgrids. On rooftop solar, I just would conclude with this slide, is that we did a study understanding what can be the benefits of putting battery in a distributed grid for rooftop solar. And with India thinking of putting 40 gigawatt of rooftop solar, we did a study, and we figured out like you would require at least a 10 gigawatt hour of batteries to support this solar infrastructure for a seamless integration. And battery can basically allow you to basically have a higher penetration of rooftop solar in a particular network. So that would be very helpful, and I finish my presentation here with these 3 cases. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
I get the trend. This isn't great. Oh, okay, still thinking. That's all right, I'll start talking. Okay, hi, my name's Dr. Matthew Rowe. I am from DNVGL. As you've got to listen to me talk for 10 minutes, and then I'm also chairing the next panel after this, so I'll just spend 2 minutes just introducing myself, actually 20 seconds. So I work for DNVGL, who are a technical consultancy. We're the global leaders in energy storage technical advisory services. We help people all the way around the world, investors, developers, suppliers, with things like business cases, running procurement processes, and taking on owner's engineer role. So the department I head up is a department of 25 people who are spread across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And so what I want to touch on today is some of the learnings we've had from where we've been owners engineers, and we've been part of actual projects that have been in the ground where we've been on site, the lessons that we've learned from deploying them there as well. This was me chairing the World Energy Storage Conference this year as well. So what I wanted to do is briefly set out our energy transition outlook, which is DMVGL's view of the future out to 2050. Talk about storage in developing regions, show a couple of use cases, and then talk about some of the lessons that we've learnt as well whilst deploying things as well. So, as a consultant, you often get asked to predict the future, which I guess is fair enough. We get a view of from all sorts of different perspectives, and to help us predict the future, we developed our view of what the energy system in 2050 will look like. Lots of people produce these, Bloomberg, Shell, they all do them. Ours is very technology-driven as opposed to being market-driven, I guess, some of the other markets do, because we're more of a technical consultancy. It's split into all sorts of different reports, so focusing on the maritime sector, the power sector, the aviation world, and all of the different parts that you will need to electrify as part of your energy use. Go on, go. No. Stop. Okay, some of the highlights of the Energy Transition Outlook report are that if we currently carry on with what we're doing with our energy transition, we won't hit the climate targets that were set out in the Paris Accord. But actually what we do have is the technology that will allow us to deliver those targets. So this really is a political, a regulatory issue, and also how do we get the money into that. And we use this as sort of a concept to frame the role that storage will play. Our forecast is that energy demand, and this is across all different vectors, so oil and gas, coal, like biomass, all the different energy vectors, shows that energy demand will peak at 2030. That's primarily driven by the fact that the electric vehicles use about 3 times as less energy as a typical combustion engine, so we see that being a big driver for reducing energy demand, and also that energy efficiency will play a key role in that. From the electrification part, you clearly can see that renewables will play a big part of that. And in fact, about 66% of the electricity system out to 2050 will come from solar and wind. And actually, if you include in that biomass and hydro, you get to about 88% in 2050. And that's a very different energy system that you've got today. Now, if you look at a developing region like Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, actually that's very different, because in Sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got very fast population growth, you actually see demand increasing. So if you look at this plot now and you can see that it's increasing out to 2050, and then compare this to what you would see in Europe, it's the complete opposite, where you see the demand decreasing. And that gives a huge and very exciting challenge, because all of a sudden you have significant changes in your energy system, the way in which we deliver energy, the electrification of it, and all of the inherent challenges that that brings means that we need to look at how we're changing that system. And actually, within the report, we talk about the role that storage will play. But before, no, I think I clicked too quickly. Before I talk about where we see the role of storage going, I just wanted to talk about some of the most exciting business cases as I see them. So we do a lot of work, and I spend a lot of time traveling around the world, but particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are 3 very exciting business cases that I'll touch on. In fact, some of them are very similar to the things you've touched on here. One of the biggest drivers for storage in emerging markets will be displacing high-carbon diesel generators. In some Sub-Saharan African countries and in Southeast Asia as well, people are paying $300, $350 per megawatt for diesel at peak times. Now, at that cost, the LCOE for storage is really competitive across 2 or 3 hours worth of duration, and that's really exciting. High penetrations of renewables, being able to better balance your supply and demand, also combined with old aging infrastructure, means that storage can play a really important role. And actually, even if you look in the US, some of the most exciting business cases and obvious business cases there are removing the, instead of upgrading your networks, your transmission, your distribution networks, you can delay that investment cost by putting storage in, and that really helps the business case. In fact, some of the most exciting business cases are around that. So if you can combine any of those things, so if you find a country where you're paying really high costs at peak time for your diesel, combined with very old aging infrastructure and rising demand, that's naturally a really exciting and good environment for storage. And one of those countries that matches that requirement is in South Africa. And in South Africa, for those that don't know, the World Bank are funding 1.4 gigawatts worth of batteries that are being rolled out by Eskom. And I happen to be the technical lead on that program, which has been great, because it's actually a part of the world where storage can make a real difference to how they run their energy system. So I want to briefly just talk about what's going on there, if it changes. But before I do that, our energy transition, this is how we see storage growing out to 2050. And I think it's great to know that we're right down the bottom of that plot and everything that we've got coming up ahead. And actually, we forecast there'll be around 40 terawatt hours worth of storage, or something that can supply a similar sort of requirement as battery storage out to 2050. And in fact, that battery storage in our transition outlook will fit across 3 different areas. It will fit across utility scale applications, on commercial and industrial applications, and also in off-grids and mini-grids. And we see a lot of, at the moment, mines, particularly in developing countries, that are coming to us and saying, actually, we'd really love to not have to transport diesel over long durations, or we've suddenly become really reliant on a grid which is very unstable. How can we use storage and renewables to help that transition? The Eskom project that the World Bank are rolling out is a very exciting program. It's all fully funded, and some of the business cases that we've seen there, where we've been running the techno-economic analysis on those business models, is very exciting. So this is looking at 2 or 4 hour duration storage that can displace diesel at peak time, whilst also deferring network reinforcement techniques. So parts of the network where it's not easy to upgrade them because you end up cutting a lot of people off, or because it's very expensive to upgrade the networks, combined with being able to displace that as well. And some people today, a lot of people actually have asked about actual business cases in Africa. A lot of people wondering where we see applications. So here's a couple of actual projects in Africa. No? Okay. Go on. So here are a couple of projects in Africa. We're part of a variety of programs that the World Bank are rolling out. We've run a feasibility study for the role of storage within the West Africa power pool, and that predicts that we need around 30 gigawatts of batteries or storage technology on the system over the next decade to be able to deliver the lowest cost of energy. So some really big numbers. We're also running feasibility studies in places like Guinea-Bissau, looking at the role that storage can play in their energy system. And then up on the slide there, you can see a variety of different applications as well. But what do we really learn as we go through these developing countries? Well, the biggest challenge is engaging with the policy and the regulators. And we've said this today, the technology is actually pretty far on, but the real challenge is that we see in these developing regions are helping people quantify the value of storage. It's very easy to do that with renewable energy, because it's obvious. You pump a bunch of energy onto the system and you get paid for it. But injecting 1 second's worth of energy at a really high power, which something like a battery can do, can be valued at a really high value, but we don't have the market or the policy or frameworks in place to actually be able to do that. Some of the biggest lessons we've learned are data in developing countries is incredibly hard to get hold of. I recently was part of a project, or sponsored a project, where we were looking at putting storage in 2 countries. One was a developed country, and one was developing. And it's so much easier when you know what the historic frequency's been, you know what the historic demand's been, you know how the generation mix has been dispatched. In some of the developing countries, we don't have any of that data, but we have to help them understand the value of storage. So data plays a really core part in understanding where it fits. The other thing I just briefly want, so 5 things I've learned that I think are useful. Don't expect to see the same price you see in places like Europe and the US if you're running a procurement process. The EPCs, the manufacturers, don't have the same supply chain set up. Storage prices have done all sorts of weird things over the last few years. In fact, and I was chatting to someone from IHS last week actually, storage prices last year went up, so battery prices went up last year. No matter what you see in all these plots going down, there was a really weird imbalance, and James might have touched on this earlier, or someone else did. There was a really weird imbalance between supply and demand, which went last year prices went up, and now they've gone back down again. And so when you then get asked to predict what the prices are going to do in a developing country where we don't have the same projects to actually benchmark against, it's really difficult to understand what price point you might get for different technologies. Utilities need help in quantifying the value, as I've said. And the bottom two are that we need to do more work in the feasibility stage in helping governments in different countries understand the roadmaps in storage as well. So there we go. That was all I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much.
Let me take one or two brief questions.
Thank you. Zoe Norgate from the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Upstairs in the previous session, we were just hearing about all these other interesting non-battery technologies, and I just wondered, were there any reflections on the potential for deploying those in developing and emerging markets?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the most exciting things about these new technologies coming through is that you can localize the supply chains very easily. So I know one of the technologies you were talking about upstairs involves using concrete blocks and winch systems and things like that. And that's actually all something that you can get from a developing, from a lot of these countries where we're looking at the business cases to be able to deploy them. Anything where we can stimulate more jobs, can stimulate the economy and the circular economy of helping local people, training local people to understand these technologies is really valuable. And also some of the applications, longer term applications like +4 or 5 hours where batteries become less competitive. They're really exciting technologies where we'll need something else to come in and do that longer duration as well.
Yeah, I would like to add to it. So basically, there are a lot of opportunities for upcoming batteries and even non-battery technologies. And we see penetration of thermal storage in different cold storage applications and even in air conditioning application. So we have seen that, but again, the flip side of a new technology entering emerging market is that you easily penetrate organized sectors first. So when lithium-ion came, it easily penetrated a telecom tower. It's now going to penetrate data centers, but it's not able to penetrate inverter and UPS market so easily, and the price is not the reason. So the problem is like there is such a well-established supply chain. Like even if a new battery makes sense or a storage technology makes sense on paper, it actually requires a lot of time in developing that kind of supply chain. So for example, when my office, we decided to go for a lithium-ion UPS, we hardly got any quote, and I'm working for India Energy Storage Alliance, and if I'm not getting a quote easily, you know, like any other people would find it difficult. And when I got quotes, they said that the lead time was 6 weeks, and my office admin said like, you're just giving us more reasons to throw you out, you know. So we are not going to wait for 6 weeks to, you know, upgrade our UPS. And we had to again like go back to lead acid, and the lead acid guys, you know, like supply delivered in 2 days. So there is a lead time of 2 days with the existing supply chain, and with the new technology, it's 6 weeks. Yeah. So that's a kind of difference. Like we're just not talking about prices or performance or anything.
Yeah. Someone touched on the point earlier that actually if we take the technology risk on top of country risk, then actually that doubles the amount of risk. And that's the other part. I mean, every investor has a different understanding of different markets they're willing to invest in, and it's finding the markets where they're happy to put their money. But there's still an inherent risk with these countries that we're talking about here in terms of getting your money out of them, like the bankability of the utilities and things like that. So if you then compound that with technology risk as well, so that's some of the other challenges with it.
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm at Imperial College. I just had a quick question for Matthew about the projects in Africa. And I was just wondering who are the sort of predominant financiers of these projects? And sort of how do they get comfortable with the credit risk associated with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So some of those projects that were up are privately funded, so they're funded by commercial banks. And there is more money going in this year than we've seen before in larger storage projects. So I'm talking sort of plus 10 megawatts from the commercial banks. And the other part of it is it tends to be people with large balance sheets who are going to do it. Some of the projects you see, I mean, Enel, for example, who are a large utility, Italian utility, they've funded a bunch of projects in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but they've done them as sort of research projects. So yeah, it's a mixture of things really, but there is commercial money going into it. In terms of getting, the risk part is a massive challenge of it. We get involved primarily in the technical part, so that's not necessarily what we look at, but we have seen projects that look really good from a technical perspective, really good from a business case perspective, and then they don't get through investment committees because they get stalled by the country risk and how the actual money flows between the players and ends up back into the investors' accounts. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And on the next panel, actually, to plug the next panel, we'll talk about how the different kinds of financing and how we can put that into projects as well.
Okay, great. I'm getting sort of signals from the back that we've run out of time. So let me thank the panel for great presentations. Let me thank everybody for coming and draw this to a close. And then I think we're all supposed to rush to the next session. Or is the next session in here? Yes. Oh, don't have anywhere to rush. Well, thank you for.